Hi, this is Paul. Over the weekend, I got a whole bunch of messages from people about this Philip Dodd interview. I poked around a little bit and saw that the timestamp was sometime in mid-May. Peterson must have done this radio interview with him, and it's just now gotten picked up by all the YouTubers that pick up Peterson stuff and hash it and chop it up and put it out there. And a lot of the religious language, of course, caught people's attention, and that, of course, sent people to me and asked if I'd comment on it. And actually, there's a ton to comment on in this video. I thought the video was a lot of fun, and so let's start a little bit. First, let's talk about this terminology. Philip Dodd keeps calling him a Protestant. Now, I think for some of you, you're going to find that really disturbing, because I know a lot of the Orthodox Jordan Peterson fan club says, no, he's Orthodox. And was it Robert Coffin did an interview with Peterson, a pretty substantial one, where they talked about the resurrection, and a lot of Roman Catholics out there say, no, he's Roman Catholic. And so here Dodd keeps calling him a Protestant. He even calls him an evangelical. Now, Dodd is not a Christian. Dodd is speaking from an English perspective. And the term evangelical is different in England than it is in the United States and Canada. So there's a lot to this, but there is something behind why Dodd keeps calling him Protestant. And I wanted to get into that because I also want to get into the broader religious aspect of Peterson and the culture war. I've talked quite a bit about that before. My conviction is that the Western culture war is a civil war within Christendom. And I think for that reason, Peterson is important. And what the Jordan Peterson phenomenon is doing is illuminating a variety of aspects and factions within this culture war. And in some ways, Peterson is like a die that is showing up a lot of the different factions and currents and nuances that are there. So let's jump in a little bit into the video and let's listen to Dodd begin. And like I said, it's a fun video.
These are just 3 of his rules. Jordan Peterson joins me now. You're clearly involved centrally in the culture wars. Were you drafted into these wars, or were you a volunteer?
I would say a little of column A and a little of column B, but mostly I volunteered.
Why?
Because the government stepped outside of its mandate and dared to bring in legislation compelling speech. And that had never been done in the history of British common law. And they did it in the guise of a false compassion and in ignorance and in willful blindness. They made a big mistake. And so there's no way, once I had read the policies and understood what was happening, that I was going to stand for that, insofar as I had any choice.
It's the case, though, that common courtesy leads us to address people in ways that they feel easy with. You're happy with that as an account?
Sure, and thrilled with common courtesy. But it's a whole different thing when the government uses an ideologically motivated claim of compassion to justify implementing careless, unbelievably careless compelled speech legislation.
But you're not against the state's intervention in all areas of life, are you?
Well, it depends on the areas.
No, but in principle, I mean, there are some.
No.
You're not an Oklahoma guy who wants to go back into the woods and get rid of the state.
No, I'm...
What's with Oklahoma? I don't know what Philip Dodd had a terrible experience in Oklahoma at one point, but I found that comment interesting.
Actually quite a moderate, centrist type of person. So,
okay, listen.
I mean, I'm from Western Canada, and we're a little more on the libertarian end of things, but not in any... I'm a Canadian, you know. Canadian political radicals are just not that common.
Your book is marinated in religious language.
Yes.
Set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world. That's got the cadences of the Bible behind it about setting your house in order. I was brought up an English Methodist. I want to know, what is your religious framework? I'm just back from New York, so you're clearly a North American Protestant.
Yes, I think that's very fair to say. That's my background. My family was a member of my mother in particular was a member of the mainstream Protestant church in Canada, which happened to be the United Church. Although I was disenchanted with religious thinking by the time I was about 12 or 13. It's not that there's anything special about that, but I became very much interested in the role that narrative plays in orienting people in life, and delved deep into it when I was studying totalitarianism, and which I did in depth. Well, I have been doing that for 40 years, really. And that led me down to the deepest of stories. And by definition, the deepest of stories are religious. I mean, it's the fact that they're deep that makes them religious, or vice versa. And so I've strived to understand what those stories mean.
Okay, that makes it sound very scholarly.
Mm-hmm.
It's not with you. It's inside you. It's not you are religious, aren't you?
Well, it would depend to some degree.
No, don't get epistemological on me. Okay, what I'm asking you is, you're a believer. Now, of course, what it means to believe is different, but the reason I'm interested in this is your commitment to individual responsibility has a religious history to it.
It has a religious aspect to it, sure. It has a religious layer to it, let's say. And I would say that the battle that I found myself involved in wasn't a political battle or even a psychological battle. As far as I'm concerned, it's actually a theological battle. So because I see what's happening in the universities as the pushback of a fundamentally collectivist viewpoint against the cardinal Western stance that the individual is sovereign. And
hold on.
Okay. A theological battle. And I think that's exactly right. Well, in what way is he theologically Protestant? Well, we're going to dig into that, because my thesis all along is that the Western culture war is a civil war within Christendom. And Jordan Peterson's role is, in fact, a theological battle, has been the whole time. Now, he usually, when he talks about the Bible, couches his terms. This is a psychological interpretation. But in this piece and this moment, he fully embraces the theological aspect, which I'm glad, because I think that's exactly right. Because I think what's going on at the heart of this culture war in the West is a theological, philosophical battle about what the nature of truth is, and whether or not there can be moral knowledge. So I want to delve first into how Jordan Peterson is a Protestant. And I know that's going to ruffle some feathers here, because again, there's a lot of hoping that Jordan Peterson, there's a lot of trying to woo Jordan Peterson into your camp, theological camp. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Jordan Peterson would become a Calvinist, become a Roman Catholic, become Orthodox? And others say, no, he's not going to do any of this while he's in the center of the stage, because he would then ruin his voice to the atheists and the unbelievers. Others say he's not going to do this because, well, he's already a Jungian. He has his religion. He, in fact, again, as many of you know, is a church of one. He founded his own church so he could do a wedding for someone, and that's quite frankly a very Protestant thing to do. Well, let's talk a little bit about the three main branches of the church. And if you want to know some church history, Ryan Reeves teaches history at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and he posts a lot of really good church history material on YouTube. So find some of his stuff. This is a still that I grabbed from his video on the Great Schism. And you can watch that video and learn all you want to about the difference between the Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and then the Protestant churches. So here you have the Pope on the left, you have an Orthodox patriarch in the center. Now, it hadn't occurred to me when I read the New York Times custodian of the patriarchy piece, what the ironic relationship is between all of the shipping that folks are trying to do between Jordan Peterson and the Orthodox Church. They have real patriarchs after all. And then, of course, the Protestant Church, which is you have John Calvin, you have Martin Luther. Who are the other two figures in there? Looks like maybe Arminius and perhaps Zwingli. So you have they have to have a radical, maybe one of those pictures is from the Radical Reformation, maybe Menno Simons or someone like that, because the three main branches of the Protestant Reformation were the Radical Reformation, the Anabaptists as they were called, the Lutherans, and then the Calvinists or the Reformed. Now, the spread of Christianity, it's important to recognize what happens, how Christianity, here Christianity's in white, it spreads east. The Roman Empire, you see they're at the same time now. Things are going pretty soon. Islam's going to going to grab on, and that's in a lot of ways going to begin to eat up the Eastern Church. There's also a political and so you have the Byzantine Empire, Christianity, you have the rise of Islam, Christianity spreads into Europe, Christianity recedes out of Asia, Christianity is thrown out of North Africa by Islam, but then Christianity continues to grow. Pretty soon we're going to have the rise of the Mongol Empire. Christianity is going to recede again out of Asia, so on and so forth. And then at some point we're going to hit the colonial period, the age of discovery, where Christianity is really going to explode all around the world. Coming up, filling out Russia. It's in the Americas. It's grown through Russia. Now it's going into the United States. It's in South America. Islam continues to grow as well. Communism, of course, a little blip on the map. But there we are now. That's kind of a fun little video about the spread of Christianity. Of course, it's satellite view. But, oops. The Orthodox Church in many ways is the oldest segment of the church. And they preserve, each of the segments of the church in some ways preserve the history of their birth or their heyday. So the Orthodox segment of the church in many ways preserves the patristic period of the patristic Greek period. And if you listen to Jonathan Pageau, you'll hear him do a lot of talking about church fathers. And that's kind of what the Orthodox Church majors in. It's also got a very close tie to Greek philosophy. Now, what happens in the Roman Empire is that the West and the Eastern Empire split up. Constantinople establishes a capital in the east. The Eastern Empire is far more educated, far wealthier than the western part of the empire. Well, as the Western Empire collapses, and it's really the church that in the western part of the empire becomes the main institution that attempts to preserve what is remembered as Roman history. You have the taking on of the imperial language, for example, the Holy Roman Empire, which some historians say was none of the three. It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't really an empire. Was or wasn't. We're talking in huge terms here. So, so just as the Orthodox Church in some ways preserved Greek philosophy and the patristic Greek theological tradition, the Roman Catholic Church preserved some of Roman language, Roman law, and really became the nurturing place where European medieval philosophy and theology all grew. You have, Anselm, you have Aquinas, you have Augustine, everyone over there in the Latin segment of the church. Like I said, after the collapse of the Western Empire, the barbarian invasion, the church evangelizes the barbarian, and that, of course, leads into the late medieval period, which becomes then, with the history also of the Crusades, bringing over Eastern texts, the rise of Renaissance humanism, the rediscovery of texts, the comparing between the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible to now Erasmus sets it up side by side with the Greek. That prompts theological conversations, and the Protestant Reformation gets launched. And there you have the three main branches of the church. I can't vouch for Reeves' numbers here, but that's probably close enough. Now, what does Dodd mean by Protestant? Well, as the Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and the Protestant in some ways preserve and express some of the things at their founding or their heyday, the Protestants tend to be more individualistic. Okay, and that gets very strong within the Protestant theology and cultures. You have more individual salvation. Dodd cites Roman Catholic teaching that there is no salvation apart from the church. Protestants, as they're breaking up the church and starting their own churches, they're declaring that their little church is just as much a church as the other church. And you might say, well, you don't have apostolic succession in your church, which the Orthodox have and the Roman Catholic have. So instead, what the Protestants do is say, our authority and legitimacy is founded on the apostles or the Bible itself. And so I can't derive a line of apostolic succession all the way back into the apostolic segment. My apostolic succession comes via my devotion to the scriptures. In this and many of our previous videos, we've talked about how the Bible plays differently in the Roman Catholic tradition as opposed to the Protestant tradition. Protestants will tend to be more activistic in terms of this worldly transformation and engagement. And I think this is a sense in which Dodd calls him Protestant. This is going to highlight some of the inconsistencies within Peterson. In some ways, he'd probably be a little upset hearing this charge, but in some ways, Peterson is an activist against activists. But activism is so deep within our culture, it's so deep within Protestantism that, again, when Dodd listens to Peterson, he hears a Protestant, because Dodd obviously has some familiarity with Roman Catholics. He was raised a Methodist. Now, a Methodist in England is going to be a little bit different from a Methodist in the United States. But Dodd clearly hears activism. He hears missionary zeal in Peterson. Peterson is a preacher. He's a missionary for the kind of religion that Peterson is promoting. So please hear nuance in this sense that Peterson himself is an activist. Now, here's some generalizations between the three branches. Now, again, these are generalizations, all right? So for all of these generalizations, there are exceptions, and there are sub-branches of the church that major in pushing back on these. The Orthodox tradition's main focus often is incarnation. And if you go back and listen to all of Jonathan Pageau's work, you'll hear Jonathan Pageau quote this: God became human so that humans could become like God, or could become God, or could become God-ish. That is very deep within the Orthodox tradition. And again, I think it was Jonathan Pageau's conversation with James Higgins, I don't remember his last name, but a guy in Australia. Pageau walks through some of his Orthodox things with James, and this is one of the things that Jonathan brought forward, and this is one of the things that attracted Jonathan to the Orthodox version of Christianity, because there's very much a sense of this is the renewal and restoration. This is human transformation. And if you listen to Jonathan in that conversation, he distinguishes that from what he feels and sees in the Western tradition, that is Roman Catholic and Protestant, where the emphasis seems to be more on humans going to heaven. That's broad strokes about the Orthodox. And of course, if I had a conversation with Jonathan about this, we would go into this more deeply. Roman Catholics' main focus, again, now in some ways they preserve the cultures in which they have their heyday, and Dante with his Divine Comedy, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, the Paradiso, Dante kind of maps out medieval Roman Catholicism and the vision for it. There's a sacramental system in medieval Roman Catholicism where that is designed to deal with human sin, so that human beings could move towards God and move into heaven and enjoy the beatific vision. Again, these are very, very broad strokes, and these traditions are enormously diverse and very long and very huge, with millions and millions of people and thousands of important writers and all kinds of breakout groups, but these are the broadest strokes, okay? So you have the Orthodox vision in a sense of human elevation. You have the Roman Catholic vision of human salvation, and that's the sense of salvation that if you've been involved in the Western Church, kind of your default assumptions about not going to heaven, not going to hell, yes, going to heaven, so on and so forth. One of the things that I brought up in some of my past videos is something that Charles Taylor highlights in his book, A Secular Age, the one speed versus two speed. And this difference goes beyond just Christianity. Across religious traditions, there are one speed religions and two speed religions. Now, what do I mean by that? A classic two-speed religion would be Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, certain aspects of Buddhism, where you have monks, clerics, religious ascetics. You have the super religious people who live a life apart from the secular world. And so what they do is they separate themselves off from the secular world and they live a life devoted to God. And in that sense, they leave. Okay, so there's a two-speed world. There's nature and grace, let's say. That's very strong in the Roman Catholic tradition. And so in the two-speed world, there's kind of the mundane world of everyday living where you have to have a job, where you have to make a living, where children are born between urine and feces, where our bodily existence. And there's some Greek dualism always kind of lurking behind some of these ideas, that life down here in the secular realm is dirty and mean and brutish and short, but life in the heavenlies is preserved from all of the dirtiness and decay and all of the nastiness and corruption down here below. And life up in the heavenlies is pure, so you can kind of get a whiff of Platonism in there. That's very much two-speed religion. And the way this works is that regular people with regular jobs, people with day jobs, they give money to support monks and clerics and the church. They participate. They receive benefits from it through a transactional process. And for example, in the Roman Catholic tradition, the church could expense, this is a very big fight during Roman Catholic's period, during the Reformation period, the church could dispense indulgences, which is the merits of Christ and the merits of the saint. The church is a bank full of these merits, and if the faithful contribute money, they can basically receive the benefits of the super religious, and the regular folks can feel it. So there's kind of Gear 1 and Gear 2, there's Speed 1 and Speed 2. Speed 1 is regular folks, people who have day jobs, people in the secular realm. Speed 2 are the monks, the clerics, the priests, the popes, the ecclesiastical people, the priesthood, who are, super religious. And so, for example, when Martin Luther, who's training to become a lawyer, has the frightening event in the woods, cries out to Saint Anne to save his soul, and then he becomes a monk. Why does he become a monk? Because once you devote your life to God, then surely God will save you, because you're showing the world how devoted you are to God. So he goes from Gear 1 to Gear 2, or from Speed 1 to Speed 2. Now what happens in Protestantism is Protestantism wants to turn it into one speed. And now if you go back and you look at my videos where I talked about this before, there's an eschatological nature to this. So in John Calvin's Geneva, John Calvin is trying to establish a holy city. Now that's a very demanding program, because here within the city of Geneva, which at this point is filled with French refugees, including John Calvin, how are you going to make regular people holy? Well, that's difficult. Well, how do you make regular people holy? Well, this gets very complicated. I obviously can't pull all of this out, but now you begin to have things like Sunday blue laws. This is obviously much later in the United States, where churches are closed on Sunday. Why? Because the entire community is observing the Lord's Day. You have this obviously with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who are both Reformed. They're from the Reformed tradition. They come over to America and they want to establish God's kingdom on earth, in a sense. There is very much a utopian vision to this. And they are going out into, well, there's so many layers to this. They're going out into the wilderness. They are replaying the story of Israel. And again, if you read sermons from the Pilgrims and the Puritans coming into the Americans, this is full of religious language. John Calvin worked on it in Geneva. The Pilgrims and the Puritans worked on it in America. Martin Luther has the priesthood of all believers. Now, the preacher might be telling you stories about the Bible, and the preacher might dedicate himself to teaching you the Bible, but the preacher is not a monk. Now, one of the things that you see in America is people sometimes call me father. It's like, well, I'm not father, I'm a Protestant. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that we've got a one-speed religion, not a two-speed religion, where Calvinism will say that my calling is no more holy than your calling. If you're a business person, if you're a farmer, if whatever thing you are called to, you are called to serve God's creation in this world. Being a business person is no higher or lower calling than being a minister. That's a one-speed religion. And the goal of this is an eschatological goal. I talked about it when I talked about Daniel and Ezekiel a little bit, where we want all of life to be the kingdom of God. Abram Kuyper has this saying, there's not one square earth, not one square inch on this earth that Christ does not claim as his. This is a very much a one-speed dynamic, and this is very Protestant. And so in that way, too, Dodd calling Peterson a Protestant, there is something deeply Protestant within Jordan Peterson's effort, because he wants not two societies, not one society. Jordan Peterson doesn't imagine that his highest calling is to cloister himself off in a monastery someplace and pray and meditate and write and read and maybe serve the world from there. No. Jonathan Pajot mentions in one of his videos that Peterson could barely sit still throughout a 2 or 3 hour service in an Orthodox church. His wife seemed to like it, but you can imagine, there's a little ADHD in Jordan Peterson, and he's getting antsy, and he's very Protestant in his entire effort to move the world. He wants to see the whole world, in a sense, be as good as it can be. That's a very much a Protestant initiative. It's very much one speed. So, in the Protestant Reformation, you have the destruction of the monastic life and the diminishment of ascetic practices like fasting. When I was growing up, of course, Roman Catholics were eating fish on Sunday. Reformed people were sausage eaters. We can eat meat 7 days a week. So on and so forth. Now, in the Christian Reformed Church, you might not cook it on Sunday, but that was 50, 60 years ago. These are some of the differences that get worked out in the tradition. But again, in this way, Peterson is rather a Protestant. Now, what's really interesting, and this is where we're going to get into the bigger conversation about religion in America and how Jordan Peterson fits in it, this one-speed religion is very deep in the roots of America. While the English that went to Virginia were coming here to plant tobacco and to make money, while the colonials that went to New Spain, that went to the Caribbean, were very much there to, in some senses, take the wealth out of America and bring it back to Europe, the Pilgrims and the Puritans are there to establish themselves on a permanent basis. They are setting up the kingdom of heaven on earth, and they are establishing a city on a hill, a light to the nations. Now, the more you're aware of this, the more you recognize this is standard political talk in American society, even more than, let's say, English society, which is formally a Christian nation, while America is secular. What happens in America is that the religious patterns of Protestantism get secularized and adopted within America's own ethos. And both political parties play on this. Listen to a little bit of Ronald Reagan's farewell speech. January 11, 1989.
And that's about all I have to say tonight, except for one thing. The past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we'd call a little wooden boat. And like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it and see it still. And how stands the city on this winter night? More prosperous, more secure, and happier than it was 8 years ago. But more than that, after 200 years, 2 centuries, she still stands strong and true on the granite ridge, and her glow is held steady no matter what storm. And she's still a beacon, still a magnet for all who must have freedom, for all the pilgrims from all the lost places who are hurtling through the darkness toward home. We've done our part, and as I walk off into the city streets, a final word to the men and women of the Reagan Revolution, the men and women across America who for 8 years did the work that brought America back. My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left it in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all. And so, goodbye. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
Now, you can't hear that and know the Bible and not know where all that comes from. The Pilgrims get changed from religious sectarians who are attempting to found a Calvinist colony in America that will be, in a sense, ancient Israel, drawing the nations to themselves. There was not religious freedom in Massachusetts. Church attendance was mandatory. Well, why? Well, this is one speed religion, okay? And Ronald Reagan appropriates the Pilgrims, sanitizes of their Christian sectarian nature, fills it in with nationalism in a sense, and appropriates the New Jerusalem quite clearly. It's got walls, but the doors are open, and the light, you can read all of this in the book of Revelation. So, did Ronald Reagan give a religious speech or not? Is this religion or is this not? Now, a number of you are going to say, no, religion is only supernatural metaphysical stuff. Is it? I think if you view religion that way, you're not really understanding how people work. You can take the metaphysical, you can take the supernatural, you can take the woo-woo out, and it still functions as a religion. And again, we've seen this in the Dillahunty thing. Peterson calling Dillahunty a Christian and Dillahunty getting upset by that. There's a lot going on here. And in fact, Ronald Reagan's speech is by no means one isolated event. Listen to American political speeches, and these are the kinds of things that you'll hear. John F. Kennedy has his own City on a Hill speech that he gives to the good people of Massachusetts, and he talks about how he's going to set up his administration and how Massachusetts led the way. Now, this is a rather interesting historical speech, given the fact that the Puritans were fleeing. You see, the history of what happened in the English Reformation is things kept swinging between the Roman Catholic and the Reformed and all the little nuances in between. So here you have the first Roman Catholic president talking to Massachusetts about the Pilgrims and using a City on a Hill, which is a sermon given in a boat. But now again, all of the particular religious sectarian references are taken out, and, well, what is filled in? Well, it tends to be nationalism. Some of the comments and criticisms of Peterson have been, well, isn't nationalism a communal thing? Well, nationalism in America is a little bit different from nationalism in Canada. Canada enjoys the celebration of their victory in the War of 1812, but nationalism in Canada is a little bit different. It's not anywhere near as strong or as religious or as powerful as it is in the United States of America. Now, listen to this speech.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Okay, what did you hear? Where do those references come from? How are they then brought into the dominant message of Dr. King that the descendants of slaves ought to become full citizens within the promise of the founders of America? In a sense, to undo the set-aside in the Constitution where slaves are not people and slaves are property and so on and so forth, but they're counted as people because the Southern slaves were afraid of not getting enough representation, so on and so forth. Most of you probably know that history. But again, notice the religious language and how the religious language and the political language all come together. This is deep in American culture, and this is deep within our context. Now, for many people, the civil rights movement is their canon as such. Now, in my experience, as with Christianity, where people know about this much, people know about this much of the civil rights movement too. Very few people have actually done much reading at all in the civil rights movement. It's actually there's a lot to read, and there's a lot of good stuff to read, and it's a very complex movement. You know, what are the ways that Dr. King is different from Malcolm X? And in some ways, those are the two main figures, and they occupy two different poles of vision. Malcolm X in his Nation of Islam years is occupying a pole of separatism, of black nationalism, and Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were actually arguing that there should be a carving out of a black nation from America where black folks could flee from the white devils and have their own space. Whereas, of course, Dr. King is looking for the descendants of slaves to be treated as equal to the descendants of slave owners. Now, of course, most of Americans today are not the descendants of slaves, nor the descendants of slave owners, but like myself, the descendants of immigrants, many of whom came after the Civil War. But for many, the civil rights movement is their canon, their revelatory experience of morality and their religious experience. Progress is the telos. And I looked at that in the Michelle Goldberg talk from the Monk debate, where basically for many Americans, well, what is progress? Well, progress is advancing forward. Well, then you have to ask the question, advancing forward towards what? Well, that's where liberation comes in. Liberation is the release from unwelcome limitation. Now, what's interesting is that this particular take gets projected back onto the civil rights movement. Because, of course, the civil rights movement is only one chapter in a far longer story of progressivism in American history. The abolitionists were kind of the radical wing in the Civil War era. The Civil War was not begun because of abolitionists. The Civil War was begun because the South got increasingly frightened because of what a Lincoln presidency might mean to their future. So they seceded. Not all of the slave states seceded, remember. The border states, which were slave states, stayed in the Union, and they fought the Confederacy that seceded from the Union. But again, remember, when the Civil War starts, slavery continues to be the law of the land. And in fact, when the Emancipation Proclamation gets put forward, Lincoln only frees the slaves in the states that have seceded, and it later takes a constitutional amendment to outlaw slavery throughout the United States. After the Civil War, a number of other movements come. The rights of women's suffrage, the prohibition movement. Now, it's very interesting because later in this conversation with Dodd, they're going to get into alcohol. That is not a mystery in this, because alcohol prohibition is almost always the forgotten element of this long progressivist movement in American history. Prohibition was a successful movement in the sense that they passed a constitutional amendment and then they passed another one to undo it, which is something that we ought to think about quite a bit as we think about retooling society, because the great American experiment with alcohol was prohibition, and Americans came to a point of recognizing maybe we can't legislate morality quite as much as we thought, and maybe in fact we don't want to. But later in the Dodd conversation, when Peterson, who has a lot of background with alcohol treatment, makes the point that if you want to look at campus rape, if you want to look at domestic violence, alcohol is the number one culprit, but we don't want to talk about alcohol. Why not? Now, again, the Christian Reformed Church is not a teetotaling tradition. But if you get into Methodism, if you get into certain other Protestant movements, well, these were, again, one-speed religions, and no one's going to drink. I was driving somewhere in the Sacramento area in one of these little old towns that's kind of getting gobbled up by the ever-growing city of Sacramento and its suburbs. I passed a temperance hall. Well, what was that temperance hall? Well, it looks like a church building. Looks just like a church building from that period. Well, what was it? Well, people were meeting to try to work temperance. Now, prohibition went out of favor, and then, of course, 12-step movements came back in to try to help people stay sober. So, progressive liberationism basically is a very Western type of religion. Progress, well, we're moving towards a telos, but we're not real clear on what that telos is. Liberation, we're getting rid of unwelcome liberation. There's an implicit baptism of desire in this movement, though, because what do I want to be liberated from? Well, whatever feels to be pinching me. It's a much harder question to ask. What do I want to be liberated for? And that's also where you have the age of authenticity coming in. Now, I've mentioned Charles Taylor a number of times in his book, A Secular Age. Charles Taylor is a Canadian philosopher. And his assertion in A Secular Age is that there's been a long, slow process that has brought about the state today where belief in God is no longer axiomatic. Now, axiomatic is a word that you'll hear Jordan Peterson use quite often. Axiomatic means it's something which can be assumed. And actually, before I was working on this, I'm preparing a video on the fourth part of Jordan Peterson's Easter message, where the word axiomatic will come up a lot, because there needs to be something axiomatic. You cannot have a telos, you cannot have an origin story, you cannot even have a secular religion, or that which is functioning as a secular religion, without a telos. So, why is God gone? Well, secularity finds the possible goods for human beings located in the world. If you listen to Ronald Reagan's speech, well, America is the telos. It's this shining city on a hill with walls, but the doors are open, welcoming everyone. Now, of course, with the immigration conversations today with Trump, you've got the specter of white nationalism. Is Trump anti-Hispanic? Is he, I'm not going to get into that whole conversation, but that conversation is happening within a backdrop of Ronald Reagan. Listen to Dr. King and his speech. Well, I'll get to the promised land. Now, that speech happens the night before he is killed. Well, what does that mean? What does he mean he'll get to the promised land? Now, Christians hearing that and knowing that he's assassinated believe, well, he goes off into heaven. Well, what if there is no heaven? What if we listen to John Lennon singing, "Imagine there's no heaven"? Well, did Dr. King ever see the desire of his heart? Well, listen to a lot of what Martin Luther King Jr. preached about, and he preached often in churches. Now, his speech, his most famous speech, is on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. If you were an ancient Greek and you walked into Washington, D.C., and you walked up the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, you would say, Temple of Zeus. Why do Washington monuments look like ancient Greek and Egyptian temples and monuments? Think about that. What's going on? Well, Charles Taylor would say, well, we've kind of taken God out of it, and as I mentioned in some of the previous videos, the state replaces the temple. In the 60s, Robert Bellah wrote a very important essay talking about American civil religion, where God is gone, the state is now the object of veneration. But what does that do? Well, theologically, we call this realized eschatology, because one of the things that, if you read Paul in the New Testament, there's the now and the not yet. Well, that's kind of on a slider, and what tends to happen in American culture is that over time, eschatology gets increasingly realized. We need to realize John Winthrop's city on a hill here and now. And we need to put that into place. Well, what do you need to do to put that eschatology into place? Well, you're going to need laws. Well, in the Puritan context, you're going to need to force people to go to church. Well, enforced monogamy. How about forcing people to go to church? No, we've got freedom of religion, separation of church and state. Well, what do we force people to do in America? Well, pay taxes. Well, this shows, however, some of the limitations of secularization, because a fully realized eschatology very easily leads to utopian demands. And in the 19th century, we see a lot of utopian communities. One of the most fun books I've read in the last number of years was this book about the Oneida community. What's interesting when you look at the Oneida community is that you have this postmillennial eschatology, you have the perfectibility of humanity, you have the evolutionary thinking, you have the progressivism, you have a belief in science. It's actually a fascinating read, but some of these trends were prevalent throughout 19th century progressivism and the religious end of progressivism. Richard Mouw, who was a philosopher at Calvin College and became the president of Fuller Seminary, was the keynote speaker for the Christian Reformed Church's 150th anniversary, and he threw out some comments about some conversations that he was having with some Mormon scholars that have always stuck with me. He was talking to a Mormon scholar he was reading a Mormon scholar that was complaining that recent Latter-day Saint scholars were sounding increasingly like Calvinists, and he was making the point that early Mormons had an affinity to the 19th century Protestant liberalism. They believed in a finite God, a human capacity for self-perfectibility, and salvation by works. Now, what happens with the limitations of secularism, once you no longer have an afterlife in order to lodge your fullest realization of your theological hopes, you must now live your best life. It must fall into this frame. And if there's no ultimate judgment or fulfillment outside of the possibilities of one's individual human life, telos is finally deferred or lost, making nearly any means justifiable to achieve any end or any telos. One of my favorite go-to quotes is from Miroslav Volf from his book Exclusion and Embrace. And he's writing about the wars and the breakup of Yugoslavia. There obviously were elements of Orthodox Christianity, there's elements of Islam. All of those things are coming into play there, and obviously in the West here there's pervasive secularism. And so he's writing about the ways that all of these religious things bled into the destruction that happened in the breakdown of Yugoslavia. And this is the quote. Here, however, I am less interested in arguing that God's violence is not unworthy of God than in showing that it is beneficial to us. A lot of people in the West have a problem with hell because they think, well, I wouldn't want God. I wouldn't want a judgmental God. I want a God who is nice and supportive and a God who would never say no to me. I want a God who would, basically make my power unlimited. And he says, well, what we're not thinking about is what hell offers the issues in this frame. Atlin, who's another author he's referring to, I believe, has rightly drawn our attention to the fact that in a world of violence, we are faced with an inescapable alternative, either God's violence or human violence. Most people who insist on God's non-violence cannot resist using violence themselves or tacitly sanctioning its use by others. They deem the talk of God's judgment irreverent, but think nothing of entrusting judgment into human hands, persuaded presumably that this is less dangerous or more humane than to believe in a God who judges, that we should bring down the powerful from their thrones, which is quoting from Mary's song in Luke 1, seems responsible, that God should do the same, as the song of that revolutionary virgin explicitly states, seems crude. And so violence thrives, secretly nourished by the belief in a God who refuses to wield the sword. My thesis, again, I'm reading from Miroslav Volf, my thesis that the practice of nonviolence requires a belief in divine vengeance will be unpopular with many Christians, especially theologians in the West. To the person who is inclined to dismiss it, I suggest imagining that you are delivering a lecture in a war zone, which is where this paper that underlies this chapter was originally delivered. Among your listeners are peoples whose cities and villages have been first plundered, then burned, and leveled to the ground, whose daughters and sisters have been raped, whose fathers and brothers have had their throats slit. The topic of the lecture, a Christian attitude towards violence. The thesis, we should not retaliate since God is perfect non-coercive love. Soon you would consider that it takes the quiet of a suburban home for the birth of the thesis that human nonviolence corresponds to God's refusal to judge. In a scorched land, soaked with the blood of the innocent, it will invariably die. And as one watches it die, one will do well to reflect about many other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind. So how do we locate Peterson? So again, in a sense, my thesis, and I thought of this after I started talking, which is pretty common. You might have seen me draw a note down. In some ways, Peterson's Protestantism is analogous to Dillahunty's Christianity. In other words, it is so baked into everything that Peterson brings to the table. When Dodd looks at him, he can't help but see Protestant. And this has because of the long march of church history. It's because of what has happened in terms of secularity in the West. So how do we locate Peterson? I say again, he's an open agnostic. He's careful not to close the door on an afterlife, but he'll often restrict himself to the psychological and avoid going there. In other words, he won't say there isn't a heaven, or there isn't a hell, or there isn't an afterlife, or there isn't a much more full ontological God. He's making the point that all of these characters play out in the drama even within our own life. Now, I did a video before where I talked in a sense about some taxonomy of religion, what religions do, how even an atheistic religion, even a religion that doesn't have a supernatural, almost, if you're going to live within a narrative, almost any narrative, certain key elements have to be represented. Now, someone wrote me a letter and asked me for a book recommendation on this. A book recommendation didn't come to mind. I'm sure there are books out there that discuss this. In some ways, this follows from the loci, which are kind of a standard framework that Protestant liberation theology, that Protestant systematic theologies have followed since the heyday of Protestant systematic theology. Almost every religious narrative will have an origin story. It'll have a commentary on what is a human being, on what our problem is, on what the solution would be, and then on eschatology, on some hope. Now, even non-religious worldviews tend to have these things. These are basic elements of almost any story. And unless you're going to try to live without any story, which I think is actually probably near impossible, given the fact that story and consciousness are so deeply bound to almost any human life, you can dissect and ask insightful questions about even someone's implicit religious system by seeing how they answer these questions. And so this is something that I did in talking about Michelle Goldberg's treatment of the monk lectures, and it's something we can do with Peterson. Now, usually it takes a while to actually discern what elements are coming through. Now, as I said, these in some ways follow the loci. There's a prolegomena. How is truth known? And I've talked a fair amount of that about Peterson. There's theology. Who is God and what is God? And we've recently in a couple of videos about sacrifice, we talked about that. I'm going to get into more about that when I continue working through the Easter series. There's anthropology, and you'll notice that Peterson has there was a conversation that we had on a Facebook group about life is suffering, and Peterson will bring in life is suffering. And actually towards the end of this video with Dodd, he will, in a thumbnail, restate his anthropology and his soteriology, and that life is suffering, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm trying to help people cope with their lives. Right there, pretty strong elements of Peterson's implicit religion. There's a soteriology. How are we saved? Well, for Peterson, that's find something heavy and roll your stone up, pick up your heavy cross and march it up to the kingdom on the hill. Again, I'm going to get into this when I get into part 4 of the Easter series, because certain elements of his implicit religion are in that. And then eschatology. And this is an area that Peterson in some ways is deficient, because he is limited by his Darwinian epistemology. He is limited by the secular frame, which means that probably the best you can do is experience meaning in this world. And in that way, he's similar to the atheist modernists. Now, what Christian modernists tend to do is they take their modernism and then they add a Christian eschatology or a layer to it. And as I continue to work through this Dodd lecture, we're going to look at how progressive liberationism has really crept into certain elements of the church. Now, I shouldn't really say crept in, because actually progressive liberationism is growing out of the same soil that it's all part of Christendom in the West. Now, I had mentioned too, Quick to Listen is a podcast by Christianity Today, and I think in this podcast, this was one of the best evangelical treatments of Peterson that I had heard. And so I'm just going to play a little snippet from it. Playing all these snippets, I hope I don't run afoul of YouTube's intellectual property filters. I'm going to start at 1632. I can't quite queue up in them like I can in YouTube. So if you give me a second. 1632. Well, we're close enough.
Couple here. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And I'll do the third one. Make friends with people who want the best for you. So I think that these rules, honestly, most of us would basically affirm. But what he's trying to do is say, look, take individual responsibility, clean your room, get up, get outside, do the hard things in life. And this is the way that you'll overcome the kind of suffering and darkness of life. So his view is a bit nihilistic, actually, although he has a positive spin on nihilism, I guess.
Yeah, I think he's a bit of...
So the first voice is the leader of the Gospel Coalition. Now, if I'm correct, the Canadian version of the Gospel Coalition is wedded to the American version of the Gospel Coalition, which tend to be conservative, reformed, Calvinists, in alignment with Tim Keller, John Piper. And so this first voice is from a Canadian. I don't know if I assume he's got some kind of theological degree. I don't know if he's got a pastor. I don't know his background. The second male voice is Mark Galli, who's the editor of Christianity Today. And the third voice is the woman who hosts the podcast. And as we get into the next video that I'm planning after this, we're going to get into some of the identity, gender issues, because she expresses, speaking from a woman's perspective, why she's got hesitations about Jordan Peterson. But let's go back in this.
A contradiction there where he does emphasize the darkness of human existence and that there is suffering and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. On the other hand, he says you just have to accept that's part of your life and quit whining about it and essentially try to make the world a better place in your small corner, in your small ways. And he actually says at some points, if you do that, the world will become a better place, which is kind of a contradiction to his nihilism, really.
Right.
But his point of doing that is that your choice is either to accept the suffering and just be a nihilist and just get mired in your depression, or get up and live a meaningful life. Those are your two choices in the world. That's what he thinks anyway.
Yeah, so to my mind, he's basically offering salvation without eschatology. Basically, you do your best life now. You overcome suffering by doing as best you can to produce a total good for society by your individual good. So different than that sort of social movement. Individuals who are good collectively will improve society. And this is the best that you can do, so you should do it. And this will stave off chaos and make life bearable. So he's essentially offering the good life, but only in this life. Where I think Christians would say that you want to live the good life now, sure, but that there's eschatology involved. You're moving towards a specific end. I don't really think he has that.
I don't think that many of people who have listened to this, or when you were reading the 3 chapter headings, would see that as being all that different from what you would read in a self-help book.
Okay. And I think they're right. And so Peterson, I'd say he's got an open door. Now, Mark Galli and the other guy, I forget his name right now, the other guy have listened to Peterson a lot, and they seem to know him quite well. The woman who is the host of the podcast has kind of only a cursory knowledge of him and some first impressions, which actually goes on to make the podcast quite fruitful to listen to. And I recommend listening to the podcast, especially if you're a Christian from an evangelical past and you read Christianity Today, it's a particularly good episode to listen to. So there's some first takes on the Dodd conversation. I'm going to have a lot more to say because I want to do a deeper dive into the religious forces that are at play in the American and the North American, and especially in the culture wars in the English-speaking world. So Australia, in the English-speaking developed world. So the United States, Canada, England, Australia. This seems to be the place where Peterson is having the biggest impact. There are obviously some people listening from some other places, but these seem to be kind of the main focus of what he's doing. Obviously, he's writing in English, and he's a person from Canada. So, again, to summarize, Dodd calls him a Protestant. Why? Well, I think, in a sense, Peterson is a Protestant in a similar way to what Peterson says Dillahunty is a Christian. The implicit activism in what he's doing, the frame in which he's working, it's all very Protestant, and it's one speed, not two speed religion. And so when Dodd calls him a Protestant, yeah. So let me know what you think.